Well, hello, my lovely darlings, and welcome back to another instalment of The Law of Hestia. And to start with, I guess I need to say I'm sorry. As this one didn't take too much brain racking to think of the subject, I thought it would be fairly quick to write, and here I am, a month later. The proofreading has stalled, the artwork has stalled, and my headspace isn't great. Even the coffee isn't keeping me going, and Patreon is playing silly buggers in the back rooms, so the support isn't coming through, hence why I haven't been sending out the exclusive prints. I am looking into alternatives, particularly Ko-Fi. If nothing else, I love the feel of the phrase "send me a coffee on Ko-Fi" in my mouth, but if you know any others, I would be mega appreciative, so please DM me on Facebook. Link will be in the description below. It turned out that trying to work out just what has gone down in the big histories of Hestia was more difficult than I first thought, especially as I realised that I wanted to contradict something I had written in the Hestia locator. I'm not sure I'm allowed to do this, but there again, this is my work. I'm allowed to decide what goes, and I can always update the Hestia locator at a later date if I want to release it as a World Book Day publication. I think I'll go with that. World Book Day publications. Flip, I aim my sights high. With the Hestia Historical, I'm aiming to do a summary of the major historical events which have shaped the world and still affect the lives of the major characters, even just by an awareness of the lingering after effects that still move the world. To make it easier on myself, I'm going to do the dates by how many years before the events of Draconic Shenanigans the history took place. So, shall we begin? 182,000 years ago, the creation of the begetters. The ancients, in their continuing cycle of war and conquest, created the begetters as infiltrators, spies, and assassins, as well as resource collectors from the deep sea. They were treated as so disposable, they were even viewed as a food source by their creators, the ancients, after a few thousand years had passed and the numbers of the begetters had reached a certain critical mass. To have living weapons so numerous that they could be culled as a food source suggests that the ancients became the dominant force on Hestia, or dominant race on Hestia, and faced no major defiance to their ascendancy. It certainly tracks with the conclusions of wizards and learned folk who study the stone bones that are occasionally discovered in eroded cliff sites and in quarries and mines. These scholars state that there is a definite decrease in the diversity and number of individuals in species at this time in the rock formations, whilst at the same time there are formations of stone plateaus that bear striking similarities to cemeteries, especially as some of the bodies appear to have been buried with personal items. These people, if they are the ancients, show signs of being of reptile descent with carnivorous diets but a high calorie intake, as suggested by the bone pit fossil beds that are sometimes discovered near these cemeteries. These bone pits show signs of the bodies having been processed for food, and so far there have only been a few specimens of the cemetery species found within these bone pits. As these singular individuals bear the evidence of brutal injuries at the time of death, it is speculated that these were executed criminals denied proper burial, or even the victims of murder that had been dumped in the communal rubbish pit to hide the evidence. It is unclear how the begetters reproduced in this time, as their cartilage-based skeletons leave very little in the way of impressions in the rock. It is possible that the ancients believed they could control their creations by controlling their method of reproduction, that growing new hosts for the larvae. 171,000 years ago. Changing epoch. After 11,000 years, a shift appears in the fossil record. The cemeteries of the ancients massively increase in size, suggesting several rounds of pandemics, especially as the number of juvenile individuals increase. At the same time, the bone pits also depict a change, becoming composed of a greater number of marine skeletons of both fish and early sea-going mammals. Though the begetters only remember themselves as both a tools of war and marine harvest, it is possible that the marine exploration process was an adaptation of their use as the civilization began to experience ecological distress as over-exploitation of land-based food webs started leading to environmental collapse. At the same time, there appears to be a resurgence in the number of opposing species. It appears that a rival race, possibly an early mammalian, began a campaign of aggression starting at the South Pole and spreading northwards. It would be highly unusual for a rival clave of animal life to rise to challenge the dominant species, while the dominant species had not gone through an extinction event, let alone a rival intelligent species evolving on the same planet naturally after the dominant intelligent species had come into its full power. So it is possible that this was the last project of one of the species the begetters were made to destroy coming to fruition. It is possible that it could be the origin of the goblins. Goblins, with their rapid breeding rate and quick minds, are highly adaptable to changing circumstances and are exceptional, if given the opportunity to prove it, at similar tactics to the begetters. They are also difficult for begetters to control with their psionic abilities. It would certainly explain the disdain all races share for goblins. It could be an inherited attitude from the begetters, as the begetters would not be kind to the species that helped destroy the beloved creators, as the begetters held the ancients in the highest regard, even when the ancients were using them as a food source. The begetters subscribed hard to the mindset of honor your father and mother all the days of your life, and the clay has no right to say to the potter, why did you make me like this? Whether this theory of the goblin's origin is true or not remains to be seen, but the fact remains that whoever the new challenger was, they became a serious threat to the ancients' continued dominion of the planet, coinciding as they did with environmental upheaval. $168,000 years ago. Death of the ancients. Either by accident or design, an iron-rich asteroid was pulled into unstable orbit around Hestia, and its trajectory rapidly degraded. Impact became inevitable within months. The meteor came in at a low angle on the coast of a shallow sea and smashed down into heavily sulfured rock. Some of the ancients managed to survive the initial crashdown, but the blackout was near instant and total. The site of the impact was close to the equator, so the aerosol cloud covered both hemispheres within a matter of days. Global temperatures crashed out in less than a week. Snow falling on deserts and ice claiming the tropics. The sun did not rise on the face of Hestia for 6 months. Within 2,000 years, the last of the ancients had vanished, their cities hollowed out by earthquake, tsunami, ashfall, chaos, and disease, the isolated pockets of population falling below viable genetic diversity. Infertility, genetic defect, and an inability to adapt to the changing climate destroyed the species' ability to recover. It appears that the begetters had already been allowed to begin to experiment with using prisoners of war as hosts for the larvae. This is probably a mark of how much the ancients were already struggling with their decline if they were no longer able to vat grow new hosts for the larvae, but at the same time could not afford to discontinue the use of the begetters to prop up their society, despite the fact that allowing them a reproductive method outside of their creators' complete control introduced an independence into the begetters' species that would have been dangerous if they were ever able to overcome the instinctive reverence of their creators. As it is, the begetters were mentally traumatized by the day of impact and were unable to maintain the psionic link with their dwindling creators and retreated into the deep sea. 166,000 years ago. The Savage Years. Hiding in the dark depths where the environment remained more stable, the begetters hunted the ecosystems that clustered around the volcanic vents of seamounts and the upwells of volcanic islands, feeding off of octopus, squid, and cuttlefish for their higher brain capacity, whilst using the deep-diving early cetaceans as hosts for the larvae. It is possible that the myths of mermaids and mermen are truly ancient legends of the cetacean-hosted begetters, distorted and misremembered due to the sheer depth of time that now separates the modern world from then. In a way, it would make sense that such beings are depicted as having human-style faces, as the begetters would have used their psionic powers to lure prey towards them. witnesses who survived would not have had the understanding as to why their companions willingly walked towards their doom, and would explain it with stories of amazing beauty or siren song that beckoned the victims to their deaths. Eventually, the position of Grand Director came to be. These begetters were mentally strong enough to dominate others of their kind, gradually welding together bands of begetters that did not view each other as potential food and could coordinate to take down the larger prey items more easily. This societal shift also saw more of the larvae survive to maturity, granting a larger genetic pool available for implantation. This in turn enabled Grand Directors to be more rigorous with their selection processes. 106,000 years ago, the Hungry Years. Although the evolution of the Grand Directors stabilized the society of the begetters, shifts in the climate of the world continued to push their ability to survive to the edge of what was physically possible, and their number remained dangerously low, some saying that at times they were on the edge of what was genetically possible, with a total global population equaling no more than 5,000. While the begetters struggled beneath the waves, on the land shifts were also taking place. As the continents slowly rose and sank due to repeated ice ages, the descendants of the goblins who survived the day of impact were able to cross growing land bridges to rediscover continents that some of their relatives had died out on in the centuries following the meteor strike. There they met new beings. It appears that the ancestors of the gnomes had evolved during the thousands of years since the day of impact. They may also have had an advantage over regular evolution, as there is the distinct possibility that their existence was started by the same race that began the goblins, or indeed the ancients may have created the gnomes in an effort to save their own species, creating a diminutive race intelligent enough to farm and hunt and work both metal and magic, but needing less food to sustain themselves and therefore be a sustainable food source for their creators when other land animals had perished. If this speculation is correct, then the gnomes outlived their creators. In striving against each other, the gnomes and goblins pushed their development even further, sometimes not for the better. 42,000 years ago, time of the repulsive fire. It is unclear if this was a violent event or whether it was more a case of long-term environmental degradation, but the time of the repulsive fire has left an enduring, terrifying mark on the face of Hestia. Seeing as the most notable remnants of this time are the tombs of the repulsive fire, then it is likely that it was more a case of pollution rather than catastrophic war, as the tombs would have taken time, effort, and preparation to complete. These effigies are massive, artificial mountains of stone, cut with such precision that you cannot slide a knife blade between the irregularly shaped blocks. Made of granite and ringed with barbed fences of a metal as strong as iron, but unrusted, these monuments stand sentinel to a time where magic and technology were pushed to the very limit of what was safely possible. Nobody knows for certain what was buried under these massive structures, but the fact that such pains were taken to keep it contained should be warning enough. Wizards who have studied the tombs with scrying magic say that the core of the structure is constructed of 200-ton blocks of granite carved into the bedrock in an interlocking pattern designed to resist ground deformation. Those that have dared to open the outer antechamber have discovered a room where the ceiling is decorated with star charts incised with a precision rarely seen outside of elf work. According to the learned, these star charts record the movements of the heavens that have tracked across the skies for the last 40,000 years, and the ones that will come for the next 60,000. Carved in languages dead, ancient, old, and more modern, the same warning decorates the walls over and over again. This is not a place of honor. No great deed or powerful king is remembered here. Nothing of value is here, only that which brings death. We laid our hands upon that which powers all life, and thought we could command it, but we awakened the repulsive fire that smoulders within living flesh unseen. The repulsive fire brings no light and warms with no flame, but it rots flesh from within. Hair falls away, teeth rot out, the skin ulcers, the infected weep blood and cough foam. If you open the inner door, the repulsive fire will no longer be contained, and we will have failed to protect you. Wizards who have dared scry beyond the second door speak of a single tunnel that winds deep into the solid bedrock, plugged with layers upon layers of fuller's earth. They say that they can sense something lying deep, but state that they cannot identify it, the spells overloaded by a coarse susurration. In short, the tombs of the repulsive fire buzz. Any right-thinking person stays as far away from them as possible, but there is, however, unfortunately, evidence that at least one of these tombs was opened fully in the past. The mass graves that have been discovered in the region are difficult for wizards and scholars to excavate, as the bones are incredibly fragile, apparently hollowed out by some force while the people were still alive. Some show signs of areas of the bones dying from several days to several weeks before final mortality of the whole body. The only reason any of these bones can be recovered at all is because when they were first buried, they were encased in a rock that poured as a cold liquid. The soft parts of the body rotted away after the rock had set solid, leaving the bones lying within hollows depicting the original person. Some of the smaller hollows did not have any recoverable remains, and were instead filled with plaster to reveal the faces of the children who had perished in these mass casualty events. The tombs of the repulsive fire now lay undisturbed, even the maddest of liches and most evil of wizards avoiding them. There are some poisons universally reviled, even by the worst. 1,700 years ago, rediscovery of the surface world. After over 100 millennia, the begetters turned their strange eyes to the surface and rose from the depths once more. What triggered this emergence is unknown, but it was probably driven by the arrival of shipwrecks sinking into the depth as the gnomes and goblins developed maritime technology. That, or traces of the repulsive fire sifting down through the water column, may have alerted them to the fact that there was civilization upon the surface again. The gnomes found favor with the rising power of the depths. The first amphibious begetters probably hosted within gnome bodies. The goblins, as stated before, paid, and paid harshly, for the transgressions of their ancestors against the ancients, a punishment that has dragged on ever since. Gradually, as the number of amphibious, gnome-hosted begetters increased, they pushed further inland, following river courses, and then developing methods of hauling enough water across long distances to keep themselves alive as they probed into environments with limited water availability. As exploration was increased and resources gathered, the begetters began to rediscover the technologies of their creators and to weld it to what the gnomes and the goblins had discovered. Rapid transportation networks were built, energy relays that produced light and heat from air movements, and carriages that moved by the power of vegetable waste being fermented. Of course, this was not overnight. Locutus was not a city built in a day or even a year. Thousands of years of struggle, strife, accident, disease, and disaster, both natural and artificial, had to pass as the begetters slowly refined their approach to surface living, and the hives struggled to adjust to a world where abundance was a possibility, and therefore aggressive competition was no longer necessary. 17,000 years ago, the genesis of the lesser beings, or lesser races. Having revived their creator's technology, the begetters turned their pursuit of mastery of the world to the flesh craft the ancients had been capable of. This decision was probably encouraged by the fact that the progress of the begetters' empire was limited by the size of their servants. The gnomes are a tough people. You have to be. In a world where a goat is a viable mount, a dog is a predator that can destroy you at a bite, and a house cat can leave you savaged. But there is a limit to their carrying capacity and their resilience to injury. These years saw the creation of the lesser races. First were the orcs, most likely created from goblins, probably as another show of how much the begetters detested the race that had helped destroy their beloved creators. The orcs were huge, strong-boned, tough, heavy with muscle, and resistant to damage, but their brains were very little and inflexible. In short, they had the strength for the heavy lifting needed to create an empire, but not the brains to resent their serfdom, or at least, if they resented it, they did not have the creativity to imagine something different, and therefore begin to strive towards that freedom. The second were the dwarfs. Most likely made from gnome stock, the dwarfs doubled the size and hardiness of the people. They are strong, stubborn, and fully capable of fine work. They positively thrive on challenge and adversity. Putting barriers in front of a dwarf is just giving him obstacles to overcome. The harder the trial is, the more a dwarf will dig their heels in and fight all the more. Whether that is a physical contest or crafting the best item they can, dwarfs do not give ground on anything, and it takes someone asking to learn from them for them to reorganize their thinking. For example, instead of telling a dwarf they are wrong, it is more effective to say to them, "Would you help me with something? To my understanding, this fact and this fact are true, but this third fact is also true, and it contradicts the conclusion drawn solely from the first two. Can you help me puzzle this out?" Put like that, dwarfs are more likely to sit down and discuss your reassessment of the situation seriously than if you just tell them they are wrong. Whatever task you put in front of dwarfs, they will do, no matter how long it takes. The humans in many ways were the begetters' greatest achievement. They are not the strongest or the toughest or the most magically gifted, but they can throw accurately with their bare hands. They are curious, self-driven, self-organizing, innovative, and ever-increasing. Humans pile achievement up upon each other over and over again. They pass knowledge, skill, experience down one generation to the next, as well as laterally across the generation. They are psionically active enough to be a food source, but not so psionically active to be a challenge to the begetter's control. Though many humans remain the conformity-driven, social reward creatures they were created to be, a few show greater potential, feeling and thinking more deeply, with a heightened pattern recognition and sensory attunement. Mentally, these individuals are often the driving force of humanity's advancements, as they are capable of understanding a higher platform of knowledge. Again, the elves were the crown jewel of the Genesis project. If some humans are capable of a higher understanding, then all elves are already at that level. They are also extremely resilient to disease, and their lifespans are far in excess of a human. They are also tall for the most part, graceful, agile, and have the ability to process the information their heightened senses feed them without being overwhelmed by it. Their innate ability for wizard magic also far suppresses anything humans can do. Indeed, it is possible that elves are the original masters of wizard magic, as they speak of being able to see the pattern within everything, and they describe magic as being able to adjust the pattern. With the creation of the elves, the begetters gained the perfect hosts for the larvae, tall, statuesque, resistant to disease, enhanced senses that compound with their own upon implantation of the larvae, and with the increased lifespan that guaranteed the begetters outliving all but the most fortunate of the lesser races. It is possible that, to begin with, only the Grand Directors were allowed to be implanted within elvish hosts, though how the hives guaranteed that particular larvae was going to be a Grand Director is impossible to tell, but eventually all the begetters were granted elvish hosts. 15,000 years ago, the golden age of the begetters' empire. With their perfected servants growing and thriving, the begetters themselves flourished as never before. For 2,000 years they cast their net wider and more perfectly than any civilization after. They pushed the boundary of what magic and thought could produce, though it appears that they never attempted to repeat the folly that had led to the time of the repulsive fire. In that way they appeared to be more intelligent than those that had come before. Indeed, a new balance between that which was made by the hands of intelligent beings and the wild tangle of Mother Nature arose. The cities of the begetters shone. They glimmered, they sparkled, walls of crystal so clear you could see for miles through them, that also made an energy unlike any other, simply from the fall of sunlight or the patter of rain. Green corridors stretched across the desert. Thoughts were transmitted by great echo rooms from one side of the world to the other, and great transportation networks moved living beings and material goods across continents within days. It was a time of wonders. 13,000 years ago, the start of the Ancients Reborn program. Despite all their own achievements, the begetters never lost their aching need for their own creators. The loss of the ancients was a gaping raw hole within their collective psyche, a wound they had not recovered from and that still gnawed at them. No matter how high they built their towers, no matter how prosperous their cities, no matter how advanced their techno-wizardry, it was never enough. Legends say that they even reached for the stars, constructing or creating or growing vessels that either climbed or drove or swam towards the stars above. But it was never enough. They were still desperate children, orphaned by the storms of history, and still desperately trying to please the memories of their dead parents. They felt the pain of their loss every day, watching the last true descendants of their creators fly and peck and sing without words. It was forever a screaming injustice to them that the only bloodline descendants of the ancients descended from the lowest of the low castes, beings whose minds were never strong and who had been kept only as pets, pleasing to the eye for their bright colours, and relaxing to the ears for their chirruping songs, but not holding on to their vast intellects and brilliance for invention. It ate the begetters hollow to know that their beloved creators were sunk so low. Perhaps then it is no surprise that the begetters, having perfected their flesh-crafting abilities, turned their attentions to the recovery of their creators. It was a slow process made of false starts, dead ends, and failed projects. It is possible that the drakes, harpies, lindenworms, and talking animal people of some Westie are products of this time. Gradually, painstakingly, the begetters built and tweaked and refined their creations, inching ever closer to the finished product. What was born in the gleaming laboratories of the begetters was not their creators, but something that elevated the ancients into a new form that would shake the world with its existence. The dragons had arrived. Nobody knows which subspecies was born first, but the first 5 arose on wings of red, blue, yellow, black, and white. It is possible that the glacier dragons, being more bestial and time-blind, were the first, and the process was refined for the subsequent subspecies. But no matter the order of them arising, the dragons were as intelligent, as powerful, and as capable as the begetters. For the begetters it was their true golden age. They loved and were loved by the dragons, and with them ruled the world from the heights of the heavens to the depths of the sea. Theirs was the world and everything in it, and it was beautiful. 10,000 years ago, the day of rebellion, the God War. The begetters were never still in their worship and reverence of their creators. The dragons were powerful, beautiful, awesome, and could still be improved. After the begetters discovered the existence of the esoteric dragons, they realized that the design could be perfected even further. Armed with this knowledge, they returned to their fleshcraft and recruited the greatest and most talented of the elves to help them infuse their creations with magic at every level of their creation. The results were the astral dragons and the void dragons. As described in the Draconic Encyclopedia, astral dragons and void dragons could rival the power levels of angels. The astral dragons, able to jump in and out of reality in the blink of an eye, while their void dragon cousins can cause earthquakes to shudder through the world and mountains to spew fire to the heavens. They use magic as easily as breathing and could outlive even other dragons, but they were still incomplete. The astral dragons were married to order, whilst the void dragons danced with chaos. As such, they were always opposed to each other, and tension bubbled just below the surface. Distressed by this imperfection, the begetters turned again to their flesh-crafting art, seeking to unite the forces of chaos and order within one flesh. The result were the Iridium Dragon twins and the begetter's own doom. The reasons for the rebellion that erupted against the begetters is unknown. After so many thousands of years and the conflicts that have followed, the reasons, if they were ever articulated, have been lost to time and war. As stated in the Gods of Hestia, it is possible that a lineage of the tomb dragons had become corrupted, their blood mingled with that of a twisted god. Their thoughts turned ever to death and destruction, but it is just as likely that it was the Iridium Dragon's own decision to bring down the race that had given them birth to free those who still toiled in chains. The begetters may have used chains of mental control and dominion, but they were still chains. In a single day and night of destruction, the continent-spanning, world-encompassing empire of the begetters was cast down, never to rise again. The legendary Ash Elves are said to have their genesis in this moment. Remaining loyal to the begetters, they retreated into the dark, honeycombed labyrinth of the underworld, where here they are said to plot and scheme for the day of their master's return, and they rise to become their most faithful and rewarded servants. Unfortunately, if the lesser races expected a time of peace and prosperity after they became free, they were sorely disappointed. If anything, the Iridium Dragons were too powerful, and when that power was turned to the unbending, unrelenting, unforgiving mindset of a fanatic, then the world trembled beneath its wrath. One of the Iridium Dragons sought to embody the qualities of a true ruler: just, fair, mild in his speech, and caring in his ways, understanding the frailty of mortals, and willing to reach down into the mud to lift up those that had fallen. If the fallen had fallen not only through bad choices, but also bad character, then he was willing to allow the Gilak dragons to work their dream magic and lock the dangerous ones away in their fairy realms where they could do no harm. The other was the embodiment of a jealous and angry god, judgmental, exacting, unrelenting, and unforgiving. There was no room for failure. There was no room for flaw. There was no forgiveness. The town was not judged on if it contained any good men. The presence of a single bad one was enough to spell its doom. And bad did not mean someone who was selfish, greedy, and harmful to their community. Bad just meant someone who broke the rules, and children were not exempt from judgment. Neither was ignorance an excuse. Perfection was demanded, and any that failed to meet that exacting standard, with every heartbeat of every breath of every second of the day, were destroyed. Their bodies turned into a pillar of salt alongside every member of their family, including babes in arms. The god war was savage and unleashed a destruction not seen upon Hestia since the death of the ancients. Every race, every dragon rose in rebellion against the Iridium Dragon of Judgment, including his own twin. Despite the massed efforts of every thinking person on Hestia, it was impossible to kill the Iridium dragon, and every effort to do so only resulted in more destruction, as the shining cities toppled, verdant forests burnt until they smouldered. Whole regions turned to desert as the salt killed every living thing in the soil. By the time the Iridium dragon was contained and sealed within his prison, the skies of Hestia were black with soot, the land wet poisons, and the seas frothed with energies that seethed and writhed. It is possible that the first sorcerers and sorceresses appeared at this time. It would certainly explain why the elves hold sorcerers in such disregard. Elves do not like things that are spawned in chaos. It is certain that many of the dragonkin bloodlines had their beginnings here, the other dragons attempting a very direct method of creating more powerful versions of the other races, as it seemed that the Iridium dragon of judgment was able to spawn his own army to try and challenge all the living races of the world. By the time the dust began to settle, the dreadful algebra of survival had driven a permanent wedge between the races, and they would never again be as united as they had been. 5,600 years ago, the genesis of the Orc children. The name of the lich who created the Orc children is now unknown, lost to time and the depth of the underworld where he'd been creating them. Neither does anybody know how he managed to combine the bloodline of human and orc. One could say that it is most likely that people do not want to know, but the most likely answer is that he had managed to resurrect at least some of the begetter's flesh crafting skills. No matter how or where or why it happened, the Orc children came into being. It was unlikely that it was out of love. Liches, those dark wizards so evil that they have turned their magic to the end of preserving their own lives at the expense of everyone else, do not love. Obsession? Perhaps. Possession? Maybe. Control? Definitely. But not love. Love involves a giving up, a letting go, a surrender of control that liches are not capable of. But what they do have is time. As long as they are maintaining their soul anchor, liches cannot die, and so they have all of time to complete their plans. Therefore it is likely that the Orc children were created as part of a long and intricate plan to invade the surface world, their muscle and brute strength designed to outmatch and outweigh the forces that mankind would be able to bring to bear in the fractured politics that followed the God War and that have persisted until today. Where in the underworld this lich was laired is unknown, but the underworld is rarely explored, seeing as it is difficult to keep a sense of your direction at the best of times down there. It is known for sure, though, that it must have been the underworld, because that is where the Orc children emerged from when they broke their chains. I suppose that now is as good a time as any to note that although 5,600 years ago is when the Orc children are said to have had their beginnings, nobody knows for certain when the first Orc child came into existence, as their genesis was hidden in the dark. 5,600 years ago is when the orc children fought their way up through the dwarf kingdoms to the surface. It seems strange that creatures who were the lowest of low minions knew that they had to break the soul anchor first before they attacked the Lich themselves. Legends and oral history from the orc children themselves speak of a messiah figure who came to them and shared their suffering before leading them forth from their captivity. Some scholars wonder if it truly was a messiah or a tomb dragon who had discovered a civilization that it could bring to a complete and utter smash. If it was a tomb dragon, then it was completely successful in its desire to bring the creator of the orc children to utter destruction, and started a war between the dwarfs and orc children that has never fully ceased or healed to boot. 4,300 years ago, the appearance of the Gochuri. Unlike the orc children, who appeared on the world stage with a bang, the Gochuri arrived quietly. One day they were not there. The next day they were. The knowledge of their existence spread slowly, one visit to civilization at a time. Travellers on the road spoke of strange, scaly folk that looked like dragonkin, but were no bigger than goblins. Villagers muttered of the blue scalies, who could shoot at rats at 100 paces with bow and arrows. Town folks gawked and muttered, watching the groups of short people who moved with confidence and assurity, offering their services as mercenaries to the highest bidder. To begin with, they were laughed at. They displayed, "Why, you shouldn't laugh at a Gochuri." Legend has it that one of the Gochuri shot the apple out of the pig's mouth at the Lord Mayor's banquet through the prongs of the carving fork whilst standing outside the open window of the hall. The laughing stopped after that, and merchants began taking their offer of guard protection more seriously. The Gochuri quickly earned themselves a place in the surface world. As for where they came from, there is no certainty, but it appears that an apprentice of the Lich who created the orc children wished to repeat the experiment, only this time with the blood of goblins mixed with that of dragons, or more likely dragonkin. Though it is certain that they killed their creator before making their way out into the world, it remains unclear if they destroyed their foe's soul anchor before attacking their physical form. The Gochuri will not answer questions about this, becoming tight-lipped and cautious, almost as if they fear to speak of it may bring some awful fate down upon themselves. If the Lich did manage to reform themselves after their own death, then, so far, they have not moved against their disobedient creations. One has to wonder to what end the Gochuri were made, or whether it was for idle amusement. 1,654 years ago, Amazar Mockblight begins teaching at the University of Cowbridge. The island nation of Albion sits across the wide channel of sea that separates it from the northwest continent. It has one of the most volatile coastlines in the world, surrounded as it is by warm waters flowing up from the south, while frigid water pouring down off the northern icy latitudes stirs this mixture to boiling point. Despite of this, or maybe because of this, the people of Albion were known as superb sailors, already building trade routes and establishing colonies on land masses far from the homeland. The University of Cowbridge was one of the oldest of such institutes, its founding marking the rebirth of a higher education that hadn't been seen since the fall of the Begetters' Empire, its halls ringing with the brightest and the best of the island's minds, the professors expected to be the most experienced and learned of their respected fields. Armasar Mockblight arrived to take up the mantle of foreign history instructor in the university and to curate the attached museum. Appearing as a slightly older human male with ash-white hair, piercing blue eyes, and a nose that had been broken at some point, Armasar Mockblight's lectures emphasized the superiority of the Albion way of life and civilization. 1,613 years ago, the Albion Empire begins its expansion. After 43 years of indoctrination of Mockblight's teaching to the younger and younger generation, the Albion Empire began its expansion, codifying the colonies as part of the empire and writing the divine providence of conquest into their laws. The archives of the museum grew like never before as items and artifacts flowed from the growing tendrils of the empire back into the homeland. In the end, the museum was moved to a purpose-built establishment in Longdinium, the capital city, which also placed Armasar Mockblight close at hand to the power structures of the empire. His advice always seemed to profit the Albion Empire as it continued to grow. One 1,183 years ago, the Albion Empire reached its largest expansion. The Albion Empire held territory across the world, from the land now known as the Burning Continent, where they were in constant conflict with the lands of the Domolai of then, to islands in some Westi. There was territory on both coasts of the southern continent, as well as in the interior, and holdings of the east coast of Jamhodan. Riches and exotics flowed into the Albion heartland, although always to the highest ranks of society. The greater majority of the populace of Albion heartland toiled in great workshops or busied away as the servants in grand houses and smaller establishments. Life was hard for a maid of all work, who could expect to live her life by the clock from before sun up to midnight all the working days of her life, including holy days, although one has to wonder if their lives were better than the companion servants. Often of exotic birth, companion servants were hired, one could say bought, to be the companions of the young daughters of noble and landed family, though some of the richer merchants also purchased these beings. The companion servants were usually girls, though some boys were also granted companion servants, who usually had double duty as whipping boys. Companion servants were taught etiquette, language, though allowed, even encouraged, to keep their accents to denote their other status, literature, handicrafts, and art. They were to be the companions of their assigned mistress or master, constantly at their beck and call, to keep them distracted in their free time with witty conversation, gentle games, and to show well at parties where younger children were permitted to attend. It was a mark of status for a family to be able to afford the education and upkeep of a companion servant. Sometimes companion servants were retained, becoming their assigned master or mistress's confidant and body servant as they grew up. Some became retainers in their old age, but they were very few. Most companion servants were seen as childhood toys that were to be put aside when the child grew up. Marked by their other status, they could not freely gain employment outside the homes of the rich, but neither were they welcome in the servants' quarters, as they were tainted by association with them upstairs. Elderly companion servants often wound up homeless and destitute, fitting nowhere in their new country, but unable to gain passage back home to the countries of their birth. A few managed to clump together in travelling bands of wandering traders, turning their hands to singing, dancing, and performance to make ends meet. But travelling folk have ever had a bad reputation, and they were never able to settle in any one area for long. And Almasar Mockblight continued to create the Albion Museum. 1104 years ago, the Albion Empire begins to lose control due to its size. Several volcanoes in the territory of some Westi erupted within the space of 10 years, starting in 1104 years before the modern day. Though individually the eruptions were not severe enough to be called more than a local disaster, the accumulative effects of so many eruptions triggered global instability of the weather patterns. Rainy seasons shifted, decreased, or increased at sporadic intervals, resulting in reduced harvests, tainted harvest, or even outright famine. Crawling after the hunger, there came the disease. Within 2 years, 3.5% of the total population of the known world died out due to waterborne diseases. Though this does not sound a huge number, it was not spread evenly, with some towns untouched, whilst other cities lost entire districts. The numbers of the dead were such in some places they remained unburied, drawing in vermin that then turned their attention to what food sources remained, perpetuating the cycle of famine and disease. Over the span of 2 decades, there was a noticeable decrease in the human population of the Albion Empire. With the weakening of the empire's health and commerce, enemies without and within arose. In some areas, the rival kingdoms saw the chance to claim territory from the weakened empire. In others, indigenous populations, long suppressed and exploited, rose in revolt against their overlords. With trade and commerce weakened and decreased, dispatches couldn't move fast enough to keep up with the pace of events, leading to disorganized emergency responses that could even make the situation worse as the weather-driven disasters continued, with wildfires and floods happening at increased rates, further disrupting daily life. As indigenous populations were often left out of recovery plans, it served to heighten resentment and discontent. Independence movements began to grow. 1061 years ago, Armasar Mockblight proposes the Day of Reclamation. With some of the distant provinces breaking away from the empire and its control weakening over most of the others, the kings and ministers of Albion turned once again to Armasar Mockblight, their teacher, mentor and guide for so many years that they could not consider making a decision without at least some of his advice. Armasar's advice this time should have terrified them, but in a land where loyalty was to the empire only, and patriotism was the currency of survival, and authority was unquestioned, it seemed to be the absolute solution to all their problems, and none queried it if there would be a cost. Armasar outlined a grand ritual that would pull on the loyalty and devotion of every citizen of the Albion Empire, and would result in the kings of Albion ruling forever over their lands and holding influence over their empire for all time. Armasar Mockblight didn't lie, but neither did he speak the whole truth. But, desperate to preserve their failing empire and guarantee its immortality, the kings and ministers accepted his advice and set the decrees in motion. First, they introduced a citizen test for all school leavers to prove their loyalty to the empire. Access to trusted professions was limited to those who had passed the test. Gradually, the list of trusted professions was increased, as was the vigor of the test. After several high-profile cases where harm was done by those who had forged their grade on the citizenship test certification, a new system was brought in. Citizens and their grade were designated by a tattoo on the palm of the right hand, displayed vividly during the salute. The rank of job you could attain was dictated by your tattoo and its color. The official inks were also state-controlled and distributed. It was worth someone's life to try and black market the inks. 1,100 years ago, the Day of Reclamation. As more and more people strove to obtain the highest level of citizenship and the tattoo that went with it, being a tattooed citizen of the empire became the prerequisite to be able to trade, own property, and even be employed within the borders of the empire. Those who failed the citizenship test were unable to participate within the borders of the empire. They were outlawed, outcast, and unwanted. Their only safety was the black market and organized crime, a dangerous shadow world that more often than not sucked people in and spat them back out as ruined husks. The safest companions within the shadow world were the roaming bands, descended from the companion servants that had been turned out in the cold. They were still seen as problem people and had to learn to survive completely hidden within the few wild spaces left within the homeland, as their performing way of life was no longer. If a renegade could reach the travelling band and earn their trust, they had a better chance of survival, especially for the women. The shadow world of the black market has a habit of swallowing young women who failed their citizenship test, chewing them up and spitting them back out broken. Finally, the Day of Reclamation was announced, and people began travelling to their designated hubs, ready for the great day. And while Albion wizards, tattooed with the highest grade of citizenship, set up the great runic mirrors to channel and broadcast the energies of the great ritual. At the appointed time, the ritual of reclamation ignited, and the world came crashing in on the people of Albion. The ritual revealed itself to be a massive necromantic spell. Across the empire, loyal conclaves of tattooed citizens dropped dead, only to shamble back to their feet as undead monstrosities that clawed their way towards the living. It was even worse in the Albion homeland. The people with the highest citizenship tattoo dropped first, trembling and twitching as the ritual drained their life force. Seeing as this included the wizards who set up the runic mirrors that were controlling the spell, it meant that once it was started, it couldn't be halted. The lower ranks had to watch their higher ranked friends and comrades fight and flail and perish, and know what was coming for them. By the end of the day, the heartland of the Albion Empire was a land of the living dead, and the tomb dragon, Armasar Mockblight, danced over the wasted land on outstretched wings, gloating over his prize. If any of the unmarked children of the Albion Empire survived the day of reclamation is unclear, but the island remains shrouded in an unmoving gloom, the coast foggy and overcast. The few expectations that have dared travel close to its shores report that it is still a land of restless dead, ghosts and banshees howling in the night, whilst skeletons and zombies shamble through the ruins of once great cities. Any who live there now must be hard, suspicious, dour lot who know only the hard edge of survival. Granted, Armasar Mockblight did not lie to the kings and ministers of Albion. The ghoul court now feeds for eternity from their crumbling halls, and their influence over all their holdings still lingers. The countries that bordered the provinces of the empire, or who gained their independence from it in the 50 years preceding the day of reclamation, still fear that one day the Albion Empire will come crawling across the sea again, snarling and clawing as the dead try and claim the living. And the Albion National Museum still belongs to Armasar Mockblight, or so the legend goes. 531 years ago, the residential program for the assimilation of the Salumi elves. The far continent had been ruled over by a theocracy for several thousand years, governed by a council of prelates and its elected head known as the Domalai upon his ascension. The Domalai was never a woman. The position of Domalai was elected for life and ruled as an absolute authority in both this world and the next, or so his people believed. The Domalai's authority was enforced by a standing army led by an elite unit of warriors called the Paladins. These mystic warriors were said to be blessed with divine powers by their god and lived apart from the rest of their people. One of their duties was to watch for children who possessed the spark of the Paladins. These children would be surrendered to the Paladins and taken to begin their training within one of the chapter houses. The children were surrendered willingly. It was a point of civic pride for a family to be able to boast that one of their bloodline had been accepted into the ranks of the Paladins. The surrendering was often celebrated by both family, friends, and neighbours to mark how much they had been able to give to uphold the greater good. Parents were not sad that their children were taken by the paladins to serve the state. Instead, they welcomed the chance to prove how much they loved their people, for the measure of love is how much you are willing to give up for it. Once housed within the chapter house of the paladins to which they had been assigned, the children immediately had their names changed and their surnames removed. After that, the grueling training began to reshape them from ordinary citizens into the paladins holy enough to be partnered with an astral dragon. Personal attachment and emotions were seen as flaws to be stamped out as quickly as possible. If a child seemed to be becoming attached to a teacher, a classmate, or an astral dragon, they were disciplined. If that did not work, then they were transferred to a different chapter house to break the bond, and it would be impressed upon them that they had been moved because they were not good enough, but now they might earn being good enough if they put the effort into modifying their behavior. The Domalies did not allow for deviance from the expected norms of society, and the society had many nasty little tools for enforcing the conformity, not the least being the penalization of whole families if one member could not conform. Those who outright refused to conform, or who could not bend their minds into the shape needed to conform, were treated even worse. The only reason the Salumi elves had not been crushed was because the struggle against the Albion Empire had diverted attention and resources away from the effort it would need to crush them. Already forced off their ancestral lands into reservations, the Salumi elves lived quietly because to live loudly resulted in their already restricted numbers being culled even further. After the destruction of the Albion Empire, the theocracy of the Domalai struggled with the pockets of undead that rose spontaneously in the years that followed, and people willing to risk the judgment of the paladins to harness the powers of necromancy that flowed more strongly in the following centuries. Due to this, the Salumi were left alone for a while longer. Unfortunately, eventually, the world stabilized enough for the Domalai and the prelates could decide that they needed to clean house. It was decided that the Salumi elves were the source of the heresies afflicting the general populace, making them more inclined to question the holy edicts and discontent with the sacrifices they were expected to make to prove that they loved their families, their communities, and their God. Some were even daring to be sad when their children were given to the paladins for training. Worse, there was the suspicion that some of the reservations were acting as a breeding ground for the void dragons. As these chaos-bringing beasts were exceptionally powerful, direct confrontation was considered to be ill-advisable. Then a new Domalai was elected, having rode a wave of sympathy after his family was murdered by forces unknown. Not long after he was ordained as a lowly priest and proved himself competent and measured, this Domalai had suggested a new method to bring the Salumi within the fold. Special schools were built where the children of the Salumi could be housed while they were cured of their heretical mindset and returned to their people as missionaries to lead them to the freedom and truth of the belief of the true God and the right way of living. The children were forced into these schools with the threat of the Domalai's army and the paladins at the borders of the reservations. After the smoke had risen from 2 reservations, the others folded to the pressure. 508 years ago, the Shalumi rise in rebellion. The boarding school program was meant to teach the Shalumi to be proper people. Instead, the few children who managed to graduate and return to the reservation had no knowledge of their mother tongues, no idea of their people's beliefs, and no understanding of their way of life. They had no common ground by which they could convince their parents to change their minds. If anything, it made the divide between the Shalumi and the humans even greater. And then the true purpose of the boarding school program was revealed. In nearly 30 years of the boarding school program, not a single child who had been to one of those places had children of their own. Not only had they been stripped of language, culture, and identity, they had been stripped of fertility. The boarding school program wasn't to facilitate the assimilation of the Shalumi elves. It was to disguise their eradication. For the first time ever, the Mother Lodge faced answering a question without the thought of how it would affect the 7th generation, because there wasn't going to be a 7th generation. That knowledge was an unholy terror to the Shalumi, and the Mother Lodges realized that they were faced with a hideous set of futures. If they did nothing, there would be no 7th grade. If they rose in rebellion and they lost, there would be no 7th generation. If they rose in rebellion and they won, they might be a 7th generation. For the first time in their history, it was the Mother Lodge who demanded a war. It was the Mother Lodge who walked into the chieftain's hut and took down the great saber off the back wall. It was the Mother Lodge that bared the blade and spoke the words of anger and hate into the world. The Shalumi rose like never before, and no reservation wall was strong enough to contain them. 506 years ago, the appearance of the Steel Killer. For 2 years, the Shalumi rebellion balanced on the edge of a knife. For every victory, a defeat. For every child saved, another lost. For every residential school burnt to the ground, a camp reduced to ashes. Hit-and-run tactics were only so effective when the paladins could track a thought and their astral dragon mounts could cover distance as fast as blinking. And then the paladins ran up against the Steel Killer. They thought he was a new leader of the Shalumi. They were wrong. Heartseer had found his daughter's body after she had taken a rope to her pain when she discovered that she had been sterilized. His wife starved herself to death, her heart malforming under the weight of the grief. He had been leading one of the most successful Shalumi campaigns against the Domalai's army and the paladins when he vanished for a time. When he returned, it was in a skin of metal and eyes of glass, unblinking, unflinching, unbreaking before the paladins' power. The paladins learnt fear. The Steel Killer had no scent the astral dragons could track, no heartbeat a paladin could sense, and never tired in his relentless pace. Some said the Steel Killer wielded 2 blades, some said 4, All knew that he could not be turned aside from his first avowed intent, the execution of the paladins upon the field of battle. The Steel Killer did not eat, did not sleep, and never tired. It seemed he coordinated multiple attacks over whole provinces, leading a battle in the heartland of one province on the first day, and then commanding a raid on a paladin encampment on the border of the next the following morning. The starlight elemental weapon of the astral dragons had no effect against metal, and they learned the hard way that biting at the Steel Killer was not a brilliant idea after one of the eldest died, choking to death on Heartseer, its mouth and upper throat shredded to pieces by his ripping blades. The Steel Killer became the highest priority target of the campaign, above even traitor paladins who were using the same power as the paladins. Under his leadership, the Shalumi were not just raiding, but taking and holding land, the provinces falling under their control one by one. 497 years ago, the day of destruction. In 9 years, the Steel Killer brought the Domali's kingdom to the edge of collapse. Cities isolated, besieged, forced into negotiation with the Shalumi for supplies. The provinces under the control of the Mother Lodges were even stabilizing, as the Mother Lodges had no intention of doing to others what had been done to them, instead seeking to comb the snakes from the hair of their enemies' leaders, so proper discussion and discourse could take place. Then suddenly the Shalumi withdrew, the whole population migrating en masse within the space of days towards the west coast, the Steel Killer spearheading the advance. Like an avalanche, the Shalumi descended on one of the northwest ports, and their intention was mass evacuation. What triggered this change of tactics was unknown, but the Domali's army gave chase, hounding the Shalumi every step of the way. The kill team finally brought their prey to bear as the ships were loaded, the Steel Killer cornered and desperate. He still fought like a demon as the battle exploded around them. Perhaps it was an accident, the teams not trained as well as they believed, or perhaps it was an act of desperation, a commander deciding that friendly fire was preferable to the Steel Killer escaping once more. Either way, the fight between Heartseer and the Paladins was bracketed with an experimental weapon, and hell was unleashed. The cliff top gave way, and all of the combatants fell into the cavern below, swallowed by the ground itself. If a rescue attempt for the Paladins was ever mounted is unknown, for not an hour later the great destruction shattered the far continent. Starting from Et-Tucan, the capital city, it appears the great destruction was some sort of vast magical spell gone wrong. Extremely, totally wrong. Rock melted without heap. Organic things warped and twisted into new forms. Flesh merged and mingled. Machines started multiplying like living things. Buildings crawled like animals. The air itself changed, and the sky was consumed by fires of unmanned hues, the color of outer space bleeding into reality. Across the world the ley lines twisted sideways. What was unleashed on the now burning continent, echoing round the globe of Hestia, over and over again. It was said that many of the hybrid beasts, such as chimera, manticores, and ablets, have their genesis in this time. The young of both man and beast corrupted before they were even born. It took decades for Hestia to even partway heal, and the far continent is now known as the Burning Continent, and none have dared return there. And there you have it, the most influential events in Hestia's history, stretching from deepest prehistory to nearly the present day. And I hope you enjoyed it, and now I'll go and start on the next one. Be safe out there, my lovely darlings, and as always, be kind.